I'm taking you into the book of Jonah today. And don't think it's something that, well, we've gone through this book a couple of times, but something that probably took my attention, got me to pay attention to something. No, we often hear the term backslider. And I think that's thrown around real lightly. Oh, so-and-so is backslidden, in a backslidden condition. But from this book, I thought, you know, there's a message not only to backsliders, there's a message to people who may not know how to get the help they need. You know, this small book, as I said, Jonah, Sunday school teachers and parents like to use this because it's seemingly one of the easier biblical illustrations. We always see the figurines of little Jonah inside the great whale's belly. It's always captured that way. But too bad people don't put flesh and blood on this. As I said, just a small 4 chapters. But if you really think about it, and I've heard people say mythological, Jewish fable, couldn't be true. If you really think about it, there's something really ironic that this book, out of all the small books in the Bible, this is the one that when they come to Jesus and they demand a sign, the sign seekers, he says, there'll be no sign except the sign of Jonah. On the authority of Christ, speaking of the 3 days and 3 nights that Jonah was in the great fish, as he spoke of himself being in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. You think about that. And elsewhere in John's Gospel, in the 7th chapter, the 52nd verse, where they say, can anything good or no prophet shall arise, rather, out of Jesus' hometown? Well, they were wrong, because it's out of this small town, just maybe some 3 miles from where Jesus is from, that Jonah's from, that area. And yes, the prophet did arise. And I like the fact as well that when Jesus refers to Jonah, on Jesus' authority, he puts Jonah in the same sentence. If you read in Matthew's Gospel, in the 12th chapter, somewhere in the 41, 42, 43, whatever those verses are, he puts Jonah in the same category with the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, giving him historical credibility. So we have, on the authority of Jesus, a referencing of this small book, which I think is pretty important. So if somebody says, oh, it's a fable. Well, it could be a fable to you, but to me, I read it and I think on the authority of Christ, and really on the authority of it being included with such a powerful, many powerful messages. I've told you many times when I preached out of this, I think the one that most of you grabbed hold of was there's always a ship bound to Tarshish going the wrong way. You remember that message? Yes. It said God called him to Nineveh. And Nineveh is that way, and Tarshish is 2,000 miles that way. And there'll always be a ship going the other way, if you will think about it, whether Satan provides a convenient vessel going in the opposite direction, or whether it's our carnal human nature that we'd prefer to just let me go under the radar and let me be, if that's our preference. But I remember that was one of the messages I think that has been repeated many times. Now, why I like this and what really gripped me with this particular message today, nobody knows what's going on inside of you except you and God. You know, we can be a little bit tough on the prophet here and say, well, he was called to go do something, and he just went about going the other way. But no one knows what's going on inside of a person. No one knows the heart except God. No one knows the battles and the trials you face and the challenges. To me, that's the highlight right there. People say, maybe they think my calling is an easy one. No one knows the challenges that I face except God. And there's times when I think people think, well, she's smiling, so it must be okay. But the challenges, if I have these challenges, you have these challenges. We're all in the human frame. We all have the same issues of life. They may be on different levels, but they're all the same. So Jonah has something today, I think, for each one of us, I pray. Now, in the first chapter, and I really don't want to go to verse by verse, but in the first chapter, God calls him to go to Nineveh. And he calls him to go preach there. And I'm going to highlight a few things that came to my mind. You know, of all the prophets, he's the only guy that's called to go and preach to a heathen people. You know, that all the other prophets called will go say unto the children of Israel and go unto these of this place. There were certain, like Isaiah, he had a certain responsibility and then in the midst pronounced woes or doom on nations. But this is one strange example in the Old Testament of God sending his chosen vessel to go and preach to a heathen land so corrupt, Nineveh, when you think of Nineveh. And you've got to put it in the time frame of when Jonah's being called. Assyria is this great, mighty power, carnal, heathen, corrupt. Come on, just think of the adjectives to describe the evil of that day. And not a very large, if you think about it, Jesus speaks of the men of Nineveh repenting. Not a very large place in the pattern that Jonah might be given, maybe at best in circumference some 60 miles, which makes sense, 3 days perhaps journey to go and preach. But he's told, go preach there. Go cry against their evil. And we know that he heads down to get on board a ship going in the other direction. Now, preaching God's word is never popular. It wasn't popular in Jonah's day. It's not popular today. Because we know this for a fact. Most people want good, soothing, comforting words. They don't want to hear about some impending doom and wrath to come. That's just not a good message. Give us something soothing. Now, Jonah's mission is bad enough, and we followed his pathway. He goes down to Joppa, he goes down and finds a ship, and he's essentially fleeing the presence of the Lord, or so he thinks. Some of us are dumb enough to think we can do that, by the way. We can get out of God's presence. And that's why I love Psalm 139, where it talks about whether we ascend up to heaven or into hell. David said, thou art there. You can't escape his presence. So sometimes in our absolute stupidity, we think sometimes God will not see, he does not know, he may not be aware. And we may actually try to pull a fast one like this, get on board a ship. And I'm going to start just about the 4th verse, and I just want to highlight a few things, but this is not my focus. I want you to see that while Jonah is getting out of God's presence, or so he thinks, the interesting thing is that he gets on board this ship. It says, the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea. Forgive me for doing this in such a silly way, but who sent the wind? The Lord. You know, that's why I said it's kind of silly. If you read this and you don't read it right, you're just going to read through it. The Lord sent a great wind into the sea. The Lord knew what he was doing. Even though if you think about it, it looks like Jonah's completely oblivious. He's gone down now into the ship and he's fast asleep. Now, I'm going to tell you the verse I want to highlight because that'll give you the frame of reference for the message. What I'm going to highlight is in the 2nd chapter. In fact, I'm going to tell you now, and I'll give you a few words that I'm going to hang this message on. 2nd chapter and 7th verse, when my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord. So you know that's where I'm going. Now, don't jump ahead of me and say, wow, of course. But of course, that's where I'm going. But I want you to travel with me on how you're going to get there. You see, the reason why I think that's so important is while Jonah was going the other way and finding a ship bound for the opposite direction. Although he may have been thinking, I'm getting out of the presence of the Lord, I don't think he was thinking about the Lord per se. And while he gets into the ship and the storm starts raging, he was happy to get into the ship, into the belly, and go to sleep. And not a thought of God crossing his mind. And it's remarkable that this storm, by the way, which is sent by God, and even the heathen on board, this is what's so funny. It says, the mariners were afraid, verse 5, cried every man unto his God, cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it of them. But Jonah was gone down the sides of the ship, and he lay, and he was fast asleep. And the shipmaster came, and he said to him, what meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise and call upon thy God. Even the heathen captain of the ship was saying, what are you doing asleep? Get up and start praying to God, your God. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, that somebody who we might say maybe is less educated in the things of God, they may say something to trigger you back into what you probably know in your heart of hearts you should be doing concerning your walk with God. Has that ever happened to you? If someone's triggered that and you just go, wow, so I'm not as good as I think I am or as I thought I was, because here's someone who obviously has less knowledge, less time, or less experience in Christ, giving me the kick in the pants that I needed, which is also very humbling when it comes out of the mouth of a babe. So I find it interesting here is a complete heathen saying, get up and call on the name of your God. If so be that God will think upon us that we perish not. And this is where my mind started to lock in. You know, Jonah tells them that he was fleeing from the presence of God. So, kind of interesting that after all this, when the lot falls upon him, by the way, you're to blame, the lot falls upon Jonah, and he tells them, yes, I was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. Most of us, by the way, are not that honest. Most of us deceive ourselves in thinking we're really not running away from God, because we think as long as we're in church on Sunday, or as long as we do a little something here and there, we're really not running away from God. We haven't made any distance. Oh boy, I could see the looks on your face. You're like, wow, I don't know if this is such a good topic for me, but it is, because as I kept reading this, it became clear to me, here's another message out of this small book, which I think is profoundly important for all of us. Sometimes we cannot see just how far we have gone. We'll take any place and get comfortable so long as we don't have to be uncomfortable in that place we've been assigned to. And you and I, as Christians, will read this and will think, oh, okay, they're just going to throw him overboard. Get rid of him, because obviously he's the problem here. Don't you wish you could solve all your problems like that? Just throw it out. That's the perfect solution to any problem. Just get rid of it, right? But what if you're the problem? What's even more disturbing about this is it says, they took Jonah, verse 15, cast him forth into the sea, and the sea ceased from her raging. That's like, if there was ever a place in the Bible where I could do my own colloquial version, I'd say there was a giant gaseous release that quieted everything. Like, you know, what people say in some customs is good after a meal. It's kind of like that. And then the sea stops raging. It's quiet. The men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord, made believers out of them. Now, I like this. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the great fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, again, these seem like very subtle things, but I put some words, and they're always helpful to remind us of a certain lesson. They may seem simple, but I think they're good words. They're important words. First, his rebellion. Jonah's rebellion. God said, go here. Now, I want you to make this apply to you, and I want this to apply to me. Otherwise, it could just be a lesson, a story. It has no fruit. What is rebellion? The Bible says that obedience is better than sacrifice, and rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. That any time we come to the knowledge of what pleases God, what is sin? Going our own way. And what is rebellion? But knowing the way of God and still choosing to go our own way. And what if God said to you, I want you to do this thing? Maybe not audibly then for us. There's some people that are forever talking about how the Lord has talked to them and told them something, and that's good for them. But for most of us, the Lord speaks to us through His Word or through His messenger delivering His Word. And a lot of times we'll figure out everything else we need to do except for the one thing we've been told to do. What were Jesus' words of concern? He said, when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith? And how many people are teaching today, I wonder, in pulpits across America, or wherever the gospel is being preached in the world, how many people are preaching that faith that is what Paul says, once contended for, fought so bitterly for? How many people are preaching that faith, which we say without it is impossible to please God? So we know certain things that God says please Him. And then we begin to go the other way. So I want you to think of this man's rebellion. And you might say, well, I haven't gone on board a ship and tried to head the other way. Well, maybe not in body, but maybe in spirit. Maybe it's been just a plain old lack of commitment or lack of prayer or whatever, what you fill in the blanks for you. And maybe you're fortunate enough that you haven't had any lack just yet. We'll pray for you. The next word, so put rebellion down there. I'll keep them all in the same family of R words. What he reaped. And here's what he reaped. He's in this fish's belly. It says, then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, and said, I cried by reason of mine affliction unto the Lord, and He heard me. Out of the belly of hell cried I, and thou heardest my voice. For thou hadst cast me into the deep. You notice here, he doesn't say, I brought this upon myself. No, God, you threw me into the deep. And I really want you to see what he's reaping. What he's reaping here is what he sowed. I'm not sure that people actually believe this principle. You know, we hear people, especially those profiteer people, who tell you, you know, what a man sows, that he shall also reap, and it becomes that crazy gobbledygook about people sowing seed, and they take the seed to be money, and God, can you just one time bring down some lightning on one of those people? Not a sign seeker or anything, but that would quiet the rest of them. Just one. But what I'm saying is what he did reap here. He knew exactly what God wanted him to do, and yet he would not. And I'm wondering how many of us know exactly what God would have us do. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we wrestle with, I don't know what the Lord wants me to do with this thing or with this person or with this place, and we start doing everything except the one thing that we ought to be doing, which is praying and asking God to make it clear. And until it becomes clear, don't move. You know what I'm saying is true, because that's our tendency, is that we will try every other thing except for the very thing we know we ought to be doing. In this case, obviously, he's reaping the fruits of going the other way, and God's basically saying, I'm going to get you to go to Nineveh one way or another. You're either going to go with seaweed or maybe you'll come out the other end, but you're going. Now, you know, listen, when I read this, I really think you'll get to the heart of this in a few verses. But when I read this, I think, read the subtlety in here. And the floods compassed me about, and all thy billows and thy waves passed over me. Do you remember in the Psalms, in Psalm 69, where the psalmist is crying out, save me, O Lord, for the waters have overtaken me. They're flooding my soul. I've cried unto you. My throat is dry. My tears, they've fallen. I wait on you. I think so many people in God's book, why do we think we're different? Suddenly we should open our mouth and begin crying out to God, and he should do it right there on the spot for us. He should make it all good right away. When great people like David, when I say great people as in mighty, mighty people in the book, cried for lengthy time, asking and petitioning. And here, well, it's only 3 days and 3 nights, supposedly. But I'm sure for Jonah it felt like an eternity. Then I said, I am cast out of thy sight. Yet I will look again toward thy holy temple. Another interesting something in there that caught my eye, which is Solomon prays a prayer in 1 Kings chapter 8, where he's referring to, and he says that men will come and pray. No one can know the evil that's within a human heart, but that men would come to the holy temple to pray, and that God would hear and forgive. I find it interesting that there's this parallel going on. He says, I'm cast out of thy sight. No, but Jonah, God was there with you all the time. While you were sleeping? No, while you were going the other way, looking for a ship to go the other way. While you were sleeping? While you were woken up by the shipmaster? While you were busy spinning your wheels while the ship might have sunk? And now? Now, this is where this should either become some form of application for you and for me, or it'll remain just as it is, a quaint story. It is the fact of the matter that he remembers God. And when does he remember God? When does he remember the Lord? He doesn't remember the Lord while he's in an act of disobedience going the other way. He doesn't remember the Lord while he's sleeping in the ship. He doesn't even remember the Lord, by the way. Can you just picture the great mouth of that fish opening up and then closing again? It's only until he is at the place where something had to click in his mind, where each one of us may have to be brought to this place. I was thinking of a mother not being able to console her son or daughter when they get themselves into a bad lifestyle or bad choices, that sometimes as a mother or father has to stand back and let the child suffer through, whether it be addiction or poor choices or whatever they choose in life. Having to watch the child get to that point where only then, you know, when you're brought to the place where you have nobody, even though people are talking to you, you are alone. Now, if you've never been there, this won't even matter to you. You'll just say, I don't know what she's talking about. But I think we all have people around us who mean well. They could be a brother, a sister, a friend. You may be feeling like Jonah before he remembers the Lord, but not quite. And there's no word of comfort or consolation that they can bring to you that brings peace. And there's a reason for that. And God help us today to remember this lesson. sometimes we have to be brought to this place just where Jonah is, where he feels he has been brought to the precipice of hell and will remember it before he can remember the Lord. It's a pretty profound lesson. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. He was drowning. The depth closed round about. The weeds were wrapped about my head. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. Now he's describing where he is. But think about it, because he's essentially describing a journey, a hellish journey. Went down to the bottoms of the mountains, the earth with her bars. He's speaking of it as a prison. Was around me forever. Yet hast thou brought up my life from corruption. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord. Now I'm going to tell you, the Lord may be gracious enough to provide, even though it's not pleasant what I'm going to say, that he may be gracious to provide us periodically with these type of experiences. Well, we're brought to this point. Well, we must be brought to this point in order to remember God again. You might say, well, how could you say that? Because it's easy. And I think for new Christians, a new Christian comes and doesn't understand what Christianity is until the warfare begins, until the flesh and the spirit are warring, and you're brought to the place like Paul when he, in Romans 7, said, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? When you're truly confronted with the struggle that goes on inside, it is then, I believe, that you can call yourself a Christian, not before. People can say and recite prayers and do the little 2, 4, and 6. I met somebody like that, just seemingly fresh and babe in the Lord. And it seemed like every prayer that was asked and every petition that was made, the Lord answered it, and everything's great. I sometimes think, Satan's pretty crafty too. I sometimes think when people get into that form of religion, and that is a form of religion, they haven't yet experienced. Why is the pattern in the New Testament given to us that right after Jesus is baptized, we see the Spirit descending, and then immediately after that, he's led into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. Now, if he's the pattern, he's the first goal, why should we think by any means we're not going to be challenged? We're not going to be tempted. We're not going to be tried. And if it not be completely the trial that way, on the other side, what makes you and I think that we may not be brought to the place where we think we're doing the Lord's will? We're off finding new ships to Tarshish every day. But the very thing that the Lord would have us to do right here, we don't do. Now, I'm speaking of the life of faith. I'm not speaking of works. But of the life of faith and a committed life, which I haven't mentioned in a long time, but Romans 12, that speaks of you and I committing our being to the Lord completely, a surrendered life. Now, I've been in services where they sing the song, I surrender all, to him I surrender. And it's a wonderful song to be sung in the church. And then people go out after they've sung that song, I surrender all to him, but not all is surrendered. There's just, like I said, maybe a little bit of lint in the pocket with some change. That might have been surrendered. A moment of saying, oh, yes, Lord, me. And then, oh, why did I say that? I don't want to do that. Why did I sign up for that terrible task of whatever? And when you come to your senses, and when I come to my senses, I'd much rather be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord than dwell in the tents of the wicked and wickedness. So it's almost like hard way, easy way. But when I think about this, I think about this utterance, when my soul fainted within me. Now, if you've never been there, this message will not do a thing for you. But if you've been there, if you have even remotely thought of the possibility that you might be there, or if you've come back from that place, sometimes what happens is we get caught up with living and the distractions of life. I know people who are so distracted with the distractions that they've been distracted with that the very thing, this thing we call church, that's inconvenient. And reading the Bible, well, that's just a pain. Most people aren't into reading, and even if they are, would you highlight this one verse? When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord. I want you to focus in on this, because some of us may have to be brought to this point, the point of fainting, the point of almost collapse. In Psalm 77, this same word, fainted, is overwhelmed. You ever been overwhelmed? Now, don't toss that word around cheaply like people use the word depression. That drives me crazy when people say, I'm depressed. Know what it means to really be depressed, and then be careful about how you use that word. Same word here, like that overwhelmed word, fainted within me. The fainted sounds very poetic, but overwhelmed to the point where it's about to just crush you and take away your very being. I believe that Jonah was brought there. I believe that there had to be something inside. We don't have it revealed for us here, but there had to be something going on inside at one moment in the man's mind that said, have I crossed the limit with God? Have I passed the boundaries, knowing what he expected of me? Is this it? Is this the end of the road? You ever have those moments? I've had them. Is this the end of the road for me? You know, you have a brush in an accident, and in that moment, right after, when you go, phew, boy, my angel went ahead of me and was really doing a good job today, because that was close. You can be sarcastic when you say that, too. That'll hit you later. But you'll take note of something. If that was the end, if in that whatever rush right in front of your eyes, if that was the end, and I'm speaking exactly the way I see Jonah, something happened in his mind, in his heart, and he remembered the Lord. Everything that happened prior to this, the Lord and thinking of the Lord was as far away, even though he tells them, I'm a prophet and I'm sent and whatever else he says, was as far away until this point. Something brought him there. I'm thinking we have a couple of people that are constantly struggling to get back on their feet in this church. I'm not talking to people I don't know, in this church. And I said this when I delivered the message about Paul's thorn. Sometimes we have to conclude that God will, although it seems cruel, God will sometimes let us get to that point because he knows until we're at the friendless, absolute, no one can help me state, that's when God will enter in. And I've known people that you try and help them, and the more you try and help them, and the more you try and deliver them, and the more you try to rescue them, you can't. Because God's got a plan. And part of his plan, I really believe, for some people is to let them even look over the precipice of hell. So that when they remember the Lord, they remember the Lord's mercy endureth forever. They remember God's grace, his forgiveness, his loving kindness. Now think of this other thing here. When he remembered the Lord, and my prayer came in unto thee, into thine holy temple. They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. There is his realization. I've given you all the R words I could think of. There's his realization. They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. Jeremiah says a similar thing in Jeremiah 16 and verse 19, where he's talking about those people who have forsaken. O Lord, my strength, my refuge. But he talks about those who have forsaken, those which another man in the Bible said, vanity of vanities. You know, we can, for a time, we can pursue. Please don't tell me. There'll be people that say, well, you know, are you preaching that you can stop sinning? No. That's in our DNA. That's our Adamic DNA. But until you're faced and confronted with and learn to, this is a hard thing I'm going to utter, and learn to hate that sinful nature that lives in each one of us. Until you're confronted with that, you will never be real with God. God will never be real to you. Until you face that sinful nature, and we all have it. There's not one person. I told you I was sitting at dinner one time, and the gentleman across the table said, I haven't sinned the whole day. And I don't sin. And I thought, wow, there's a lie, and lie, and another lie. I felt like saying, would you like to repent now? We're all sinners. That's the beauty of Romans 3:23. All have sinned. Now, that's not the license to sin all the more, but it should be the reality check until we come to hate that nature. And that nature lives in us, around us. It is the clay earthen vessel. We have this treasure in earthen vessel, which is God's nature, in us. But the crock of clay. So I like this. They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. You want to lean on something other than God? You want to run somewhere away from God? Think again. I referenced Psalm 139. Think again what he says. Ascending up to heaven, God, you're there. Or if I should descend into hell, you're there. Wherever I go, I can't escape your presence. Think of how silly that is, that especially for some, and I want this to be a help today for the ones who are wrestling to get back on their feet. You know who you are. The ones who are really trying to get up and you say, today is going to be different. And today is the same as yesterday, is the same as last week, and you just can't get it together. I want you to remember this passage, because it wasn't until Jonah was brought to the place of almost, we'll call it annihilation, spiritual annihilation. And then you remember the Lord. I've had dark days. I've told you I've had dark days and times when probably not the times that you think. Some people think, were my darkest days around Dr. Scott's sickness or around his death? No. Because I believed wholeheartedly for a miracle, and I understood the way things happen and why they did, and I've never looked at those things. And of course, the flesh says it wouldn't have been nice to have more years, but the Spirit understands why. I get it. And not to add on to this message, but my darker times have been surrounded by people. You can be in a room full of people. I'm not speaking of the sanctuary, but you can be in a room full of people, surrounded by people that you know, and be alone. You ever been there? Or the people that you think you know, you don't know them at all. It scares the liver out of me sometimes. That I think the people that should know me, they don't know me. They don't even understand me. And then the introspective mind begins that journey that sometimes it's just better to close all the doors. And the danger of that is what Paul said. The danger of, in preaching to others sometimes. You know, you can alienate yourself. You can become that which is also displeasing before God. There's this very fine line. So in preaching to you, I'm also preaching to myself. But I've remembered God in the times of darkness. What's helped me is the reality that no one can help me except Him. Now, if that makes sense to you, this message will become something that you take to yourself, and you begin to remember the Lord, that as much as we love our friends and our family and the people around us, and they may say something that in the moment of our need we say, I needed that. But spiritually, there's no one but God that can bring you back from that place. And until you are brought to the brink And no one knows. For each person, it's different. I know that at least for a few families in this church, it's been a tough year or two. And the trials that have come have seemed like one precipice after another. I want you to look on those things and say, God knows exactly what He's doing. And in the process of all this, maybe it is your son or your daughter, or it's your husband or your wife, it's your friend. I want you to recognize you keep praying for them and lifting them up before God, but maybe God has to do that work of bringing them to the place where they are ready to come back, and they will begin to remember the Lord, where their soul is almost over. It's so painful to think of this. How could God bring someone to the point where their soul is almost crushed? But yet this is the way it works. That's why I said the message I preach is not for people just starting out. Because for people just starting out, what I'm saying sounds like a dismal, how could this be? But yet, this is a prophet of God, and it happened to him. A man of God, called of God, and it happened to him. And if it happened to him, it can happen to you, and it can happen to me. And that's why I said I love this little book. It helps me to understand. And here's the turnaround. After all of this, coming back and remembering the Lord, and they that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. He says, but I will sacrifice unto thee with the voice of thanksgiving. And you know, you cannot do that. You cannot give thanks. There's just no way until you're brought back from the precipice, until you've actually looked over, seen that you've been rescued and delivered, and you're on your way back, where you say, thank God you delivered me just in time. Had it been a day more, had it been an hour more, had it been a minute more, and perhaps I really would have been overwhelmed. And I will pay that I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. And the Lord spake unto the fish and vomited out Jonah. I love that, on a dry land. There's always a happy ending somewhere. Now, pun intended. Now, you read this, and you think, okay, I got the picture. Sometimes it's impossible to remember the Lord while you're in the midst of going the wrong way. You can even be asleep in the middle of the storm. I confess to you, I've done that before. Not proud of it. Then you wake up, hopefully, or the Lord wakes you up. Now, lest you think this is just from, I hear people, this drives me nuts. It's a good little story, and that drives me crazy. Because these are lifelines to those who need it. But lest you think it's just something or other, take a page from a real life person. Out of 131, wonder how they came up with that, 131 Christians everyone should know, is the story of a man who you know, his name is very familiar, by the name of John Newton. And his best known hymn, of course, is Amazing Grace. And when you hear the words that he penned, that we sing so freely, that saved a wretch like me. Go back and read his story, and you see the parallel of something with Jonah. Newton was brought up by a Christian mother who taught him the Bible at an early age. But she died of tuberculosis when Newton was 7. At the age of 11, Newton went on his first of 6 sea voyages with the merchant Navy captain. He lost his first job because of unsettled behavior and impatience of restraint, a pattern that would persist for years. You ever known anybody that they said, you can't help him? You can't help her. There's nothing to do. Especially maybe you parents with kids. You might have been told by some counselor or some doctors, nothing to do. unsettled behavior, impatience of restraint, a pattern that would persist for years. He spent his later teen years at sea. Then he rebelled against the discipline of the Royal Navy, and he deserted. That's not bad enough, so you see, he's a runaway, just like Jonah. He was caught, put in irons, and flogged. He eventually convinced his superiors to discharge him to a slaver ship. Espousing free-thinking principles, he remained arrogant and insubordinate. He lived with moral abandon. I sinned with a high hand, he later wrote, and made it my study to tempt and seduce others. He took up employment with a slave trader who owned a plantation of lemon trees on an island off of West Africa. But he was treated cruelly by the master and the slaver's African mistress. Soon Newton's clothes turned to rags, and Newton was forced to beg for food to stave off his hunger. You think about this, this has also all the pepperings paralleled with Jonah to the prodigal son. The sluggish sailor was transferred to the service of the captain of the Greyhound, a Liverpool ship, in 1747. And on its homeward journey, the ship was overtaken by an enormous storm. Newton had been reading Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ and was struck by a line about the, quote, uncertain continuance of life. He also recalled the passage in Proverbs, because I have called and ye have refused, I also will laugh at your calamity. He converting during the storm, though he admitted later, I cannot consider myself to have been a believer in the full sense of the word. Newton then served as mate and then as captain of a number of slave ships, hoping as a Christian to restrain the worst excesses of the slave trade, promoting the life of God in the soul of both his crew and his African cargo. After leaving the sea for an office job in 1755, Newton held Bible studies in his Liverpool home. It's a far cry from his tumultuous and unsettled behavior and impatience of restraint from the early years. Influenced by both the Whitefield and Wesley, he adopted a mild Calvinistic view and became increasingly disgusted with the slave trade and his role in it. He quit, was ordained in the Anglican Church, and in 1764 took the parish in Olney. And this is interesting because he, 3 years later, is paired up with the poet William Cowper, who's that famous hymn writer. We sing There is a Fountain is one of his songs. And Newton wrote every Thursday evening, he would write songs to be sung during the prayer service. So he wrote a tremendous amount of songs. The best known of them, of course, is Amazing Grace. And I thought it would be good to read something because we sing the song here, but I thought it would be good to read something that we don't sing from the original words. You see, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Think of his story that saved a wretch like me. Think of what I just read to you out of Jonah. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear in the hour I first believed. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. We've never sung that. I thought that was kind of interesting. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I've already come. 'Tis grace that hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. And just for you song aficionados, the last one was added probably 30 years after his death, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. To you, Jonahs, fleeing, or to you who are almost overwhelmed, or to you maybe today who are just being brought back from the precipice, and remembering God today. Remember this, that He is gracious, forgiving, and just like the parable I just referenced of the prodigal son, or what I call the parable of the father, for you few steps that you take, call them 2 or 5 or 10, He takes twice as many to come meet you. And unlike many of the people around us, He never says why. Explain yourself. He's looking for the right attitude that says, I've sinned, I realize my sin, I remember you, God, and I would like to be restored. And in that moment, He restores you to the place you once had. Sounds easy. I pray that the Lord will use this to help those who are on the brink or trying to get back. And if you've already made your way back, remember that God has something just for you. Don't think someone else will come along and do what only God has called you to do. And that puts some heavy weight of responsibility on your back. Don't think you can run away. God's still watching over you, whether you think you're slinking away, running away, or marathoning away. God's got you in His sight. Just remember that today. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.